Hello, welcome to Paranormal News Ireland. My name is Caroline Barry. So, thank you very much for joining me. What I'm going to do in this series of podcasts is really to just look at all things paranormal. So that will include UFOs, UAPs, aliens, alien abductions, spirits, the spirit world, magic, esoteric traditions, alchemy, ghosts, reincarnation, mediumship, EVP, electronic voice projection, or ITC, which would be instrumental trans-communication, same thing. Out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, anything anomalous. I will be researching and hopefully bringing some new information into the field. I'm very interested in the paranormal. So just to give you a little bit of background information on me, I am a sculptor. I have a studio here in the Midlands of Ireland. So I work with ceramics, and I'm also an illustrator and a writer. So I just have, this isn't a plug, this is just to let you know that I do these things. Just to show you that my research has to be pretty on point, because if I'm going into publication. So these are my novels. This is the most recent one, The Delocker, and that's about spiritual possession, if you like. These are my illustrated works. My most recent illustrated work is on dying and near-death experiences, because I'm very interested in it. This is a book from an independent Irish journalist that I illustrated, called The Lay of the Land. So just to show that I am interested in all things paranormal for a long time. So I might just put these over here, just to get them out of the way. And maybe to also talk a little bit about my research methods, just so you get to know a little bit of my approach. So I tend to like very conventionally educated scientists who are working in the field of the paranormal, that have a certain amount of scientific rigor with regard to how they collect their data. So people like, and anybody who might have worked as an engineer in, say, Skunk Works, or in Lockheed, so, or NASA, or any of any forward-thinking engineering company. I'm kind of interested in people who would have a proven record of critical thinking ability. So people like, if you're interested in the paranormal, I'm going to be mentioning this guy again and again and again. His name is Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. He has been broadcasting on the paranormal since the 70s, since he had hair. He hasn't got hair now. He is a wonderful interviewer. His original degree was in criminology, and then he went on to receive the only master's in the world in the paranormal from Berkeley University on telekinesis and the PK man. So definitely I will constantly refer you to Jeffrey Mishlove's site. If you are not on it, go look it up now on YouTube, because he's amazing. So people like Russell Targ, who is a leading physicist in laser technology, and then ended up heading the remote viewing team over in Stanford Research Institute. Dr. Stephen Swartz, who's also a remote viewer. People like Dr. Gary E. Schwartz, who's a Harvard-educated psychiatrist, currently working with EVP. And I suppose, talking of Harvard educated, the wonderful Dr. John E. Mack, who wrote this book on abduction. As most of you know, Dr. Mack won the Pulitzer Prize for his book on Lawrence of Arabia. He was also a professor at Harvard University, head of the psychiatric department, or psychiatrist section. The thing about Dr. Mack is that, sadly he's deceased now, he really brought the whole idea of alien abduction into mainstream in a way that was taken very seriously. When the artist Bud Hopkins approached Dr. Mack, he was going, yeah, I'll deal with your clients who are coming to you telling you they've been abducted by aliens. Because at the time, Dr. Mack thought, I've discovered a new pathology. But no, his conclusion at the end of all of his research was that, in fact, something was happening, that his clients weren't neurotic, they weren't showing any kind of pathological disorders, they were showing things like PTSD. So Dr. Mack had put his reputation and his good name to believing these people and really sincerely thinking they're bringing honest testimony back to the collective. So I will mention Dr. Mack quite a bit. The other person that I will probably refer to a lot, my mouse is resting on his book, Ingo Swann. Now, Ingo Swann's very interesting. He was an artist. This is a UFO that he painted, this piece here. And this is his book called Penetration. I think Ingo had a very male sense of humour. But I think he was also trying to indicate that we don't really understand space. And that space isn't an empty openness, but rather, I think he almost saw it like a sea of information. And considering that the recent defense minister from Israel, now retired, has said that we are in contact with aliens, but that until we understand time and space, the information isn't really going to be released, or it's going to be drip fed into the public or into the collective. So it's that interesting thing of what is time and space. But this book is fantastic. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. It talks about his early introduction into the remote viewing program on behalf of the American government. And his opening chapter is really interesting because he deals with, I suppose, what we might effectively call a man in black, but he deals with a particular covert official by the name of Mr. Axelrod. And Mr. Axelrod and I think one other brought Ingo out into the American countryside to witness a UFO operating in the area. And it's actually kind of, it's not a very pleasant experience. So we'll also be looking at Ingo, obviously, when we go into remote viewing, when I do a podcast on remote viewing for you. But I love his work. His work is very, very readable. And then, just to show there's other people that we'll be looking at with regard to UFOs, that's another Ingo Swann book, and that would be Terence Mckenna. So most of you will know Terence Mckenna from the psychedelic community. He would have been very much, he's sadly passed away, he would have been very much to the forefront of that group of people that call themselves psychonauts, where they are exploring the external fringes of consciousness through psychedelia and reporting back to the collective their experiences. But he has a very interesting piece in this book on UFOs. And actually it will come up later when we're looking at a particular article about an Irish UFO. So with Terence Mckenna, very wonderfully articulate. Again, somebody who was very much interviewed by Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. So Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove interviewed Russell Targ, he's a great friend of Russell's, John E. Mack, Terence Mckenna, anybody who was anybody in the realm of the paranormal and who were good communicators, Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove has interviewed. So I would absolutely recommend that you go to their sites. So you can see that actually I like to get my source material from essentially initially from pretty conventional collectors of data, but unconventional insofar as they're working in the field of the paranormal. So somebody like Dean Radin, if none of you know Dean Radin's work, he's very interesting. He works with the Noetic Society. He was a virtual violinist and went on to become an engineer, and then subsequently now currently does experiments, live experiments, and does also collects meta-analysis or generates meta-analysis on the field of the paranormal. And that could be anything from clairvoyance, precognition, telekinesis, anything that I don't know if they're doing, I think not anything paranormal Dean Radin is interested in as well. So I need Ingo back because I'm going to put my mouse on Ingo. So today's opening, wherever you are in the world looking at this, on the paranormal in Ireland, I'm going to be looking at UFOs. So as you know, very recently, the acronym for the UFO, Unidentified Flying Object, has been altered. The American government are very keen for us to call them UAPs, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. Now, a lot of people have problems with this because they feel that it's a way of fudging the field of research. It's a way of disconnecting previous data that has been collected on UFOs, and it's, you know, so they're not kind of happy about the new acronym. But I'm okay with it because I suppose for those of us who are interested in the paranormal, you do know that there are several different phenomena that can happen in air. Some of them, yes, most of them actually do look like craft, actually look like spaceships. So you can call them a UFO because they look like an object. But then you have the other aerial phenomena like the Foo Fighters, the plasma balls. I think there was a group of astronauts that reported back, I don't know if they were Russian or American, reported back seeing, when they looked out the window, seeing what for all intents and purposes looked like a host of angels. They were long golden beings, about 10 foot tall with wings. So that's another aerial phenomena. Even Oumuamua that came and intersected our solar system, when it flew in, an awful lot of astrophysicists are saying it's behaving so strangely that perhaps it's a UAP. So we're going to look at a UAP or a UFO report here from Ireland. I just would like to start with, the first cataloguing of a UFO being seen in Ireland. And what's so interesting about this is that I came across this in a lovely book called The Irish Book of Death and Flying Ships. And it's edited by a guy called Tim Coates. And in it, he has collated a whole series of just really interesting marginalia or just small quotes that have been stuffed into pretty conventional ancient manuscripts, and these jump out and kind of go, wait a minute, what just happened here? So it's very so in the book there'd be an awful lot about, oh, there was red snow, or all the cattle died of a thing called the murrain, or a strange plague came to a local village. But this book was the first place that I saw, and that's why he called it Flying Ships, that I saw an entry relating to an ancient Irish manuscript from a monastic site not far from where I live. I live in the Midlands of Ireland, and the monastic site is Clonmacnoise. And for those of you who don't live in Ireland, Clonmacnoise is on the River Shannon, and it is a pretty ancient Celtic Irish settlement. Now, more recent ground penetrating radar has shown that it was actually quite a large conurbation. There were about 30,000 inhabitants at one point in Clonmacnoise, which is really large considering it's the medieval period. So at this particular centre, there were scribes. And in the Irish Book of Death and Flying Ships, he noted that one of the scribes from Clonmacnoise said, "Today we saw flying ships." Now, because I don't have the book with me, I remember it as, today we saw 3 flying ships in the air and we waved to the inhabitants and the inhabitants waved back. But I don't have the book with me, so don't quote me directly on that. However, there is a very interesting site, I'm going to put all these in my notes, called Think Anomalous, and it is a blog that is written by a guy called Jason Charbonneau. He's Canadian. And in it, he has, here we go, he has a direct quote from one of the manuscripts. So I'm just going to read you a direct quote. So he has really, really interesting material on ancient Irish sightings of UFOs that are recorded. So just to show that it goes way back. I mean, look, we know Ancient Aliens has this well and truly covered, but just to show that in Ireland, it goes way back. So I'm just going to read a very small piece. The earliest references to flying ships over the British Isles are found in 4 Irish annals. So the annals would be a brief year-by-year historical records of major events. There are also mentioned in some manuscripts, so one of the manuscripts is called the Book of Invasions, and that was first compiled in the 11th century. And I'm just going to go directly to apparently recorded contemporaneously with the events. They state that there were various sightings in 743 AD, 744 AD, and 748 AD. But only one of the Annals of Ulster, which dates to 748, mentions the location. And the location is Clonmacnoise. The entry places the event at Clonmacnoise, a borough or a monastery on the River Shannon that remained one of the leading centres of learning and culture in Ireland for the next 600 years. So here's what the remark said. And it was entered, a similar incident was entered into the Book of Leinster. So this is the Book of Invasions and the Book of Leinster. And he has, in inverted commas here, 3 ships voyaging in the air were seen over an assembly or the Taltine Games during the reign of King Donal, which began in 743. So, just to show, UFOs have long been coming to Ireland, and I'm going to put that site down, so if you want to do a little bit more research on that site. Sorry, I have something in my eye. That you can look it up. But I'm going to go to a more contemporaneous recording of a UFO that appeared in our local newspaper here in the Midlands. So it appeared in the Westmeath Examiner, and I think the article was written on the 7th of February 2021, I think. So, but it's certainly this year. And here she blows. It's a couple. They put their observation on an international UFO site, a data collecting site. And I suppose this is the thing that Richard Dolan talks about. So Richard Dolan is a fantastic researcher. I'm going to be putting recommendations down as to who I think are wonderful to listen to. Richard Dolan would be one. Linda Moulton Howe is another. There's just so many people in the field that are doing such good work. Joe Rogan, Lex Freeman, so really interesting podcasters and researchers who bring very good information. So here we are with the Westmeath Examiner here. And this is how the article opens. Mullingar couple claims to have viewed UFO for 8 minutes. A report describing an alleged UFO sighting in Mullingar has been filed by the National UFO Reporting Centre website. The report, filed anonymously by a 43-year-old poster, described an 8-minute sighting which occurred at 1:45 a.m. on the 4th of May last. Now, I'm just going to do this. According to the writer who posted on the site, the craft was circular and remained stationary in the sky for 8 minutes. The informant stated that she was in bed at about 1:40 a.m. Her partner entered the bedroom with the intention of retiring for the night. Happening to look out the window, he was taken aback by what he saw and shouted his girlfriend's name and that there was something in the sky. I jumped out of bed to see it, and there was something big, circular shape, flashing lights, changing colours, green, yellow, red, blue, the woman wrote, making clear that she too was shocked. Now, this is very interesting information. You see that it's thin enough on the ground, but that particular shape, if you go through the taxonomy of the kind of shapes of craft that are sighted, that particular shape is pretty universal. So large circular flashing lights. You see it in the footage with regard to the Phoenix lights in the 1990s. So take a look at that footage. Steven Spielberg used it in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you know. So it's not unusual to have a very large circular shaped object. But just to go through some of the taxonomy of shapes that are out there, you have disc shape, triangular shape, pyramid shaped, circular shape with lights, egg shaped, cigar shaped, spherical shaped, rectangular shaped. There's actually, now I went to look up, it's very interesting when I was researching for this particular podcast, how I couldn't find videos on YouTube that I had been able to find so easy before. And one of them included this woman said she'd managed to take a photograph that there was a UFO that kept flashing in and out of, so they seem to have some ability to cloak. This is a universal phenomenon. They seem to have some ability to cloak. So this particular woman had taken a photograph of what was a rectangular shaped object, but it was sliced. It had kind of buttresses between windows that were kind of dark. And it was taken over a dam that was being built in America. And I can't find it online now, so I can't put it up, and I can't recommend you to go look at it. So I'm interested even that information has been pulled from line. In the discussion, she claimed somehow to have discovered that it was of reptilian origin. I can't verify that. And just to go then, if you're interested in ancient manuscripts and ancient recordings of the shapes of UFOs, you'll know of the Vedic texts that contain drawings, and they're quite mechanical and detailed drawings of their flying ships that they called Vimana. And they look like, what do they look like? They look like a Cadbury's walnut whip. So they're kind of conical without the top. So there's a whole load of shapes, which either are just various styles from one alien community, or perhaps multiple styles from multiple alien communities. But either way, what has been seen and recorded, you've David Fravor's Tic Tac shape, this very recent release from the Pentagon. Oh, and the shape from the Pentagon that is like a spinning top. It's kind of spherical and on a gimbal, and it's doing these really fantastic maneuvers. And again, you can see them online. But what I have noticed is that before, when I inputted into the search bar, there was a kind of a wonderful, kind of just ubiquitous different sightings and videos, and I've noticed that a lot have gone missing. So I don't know if that's a tactical decision by central search engines. I don't know. Anyway, so the style and shape of UFOs or UAPs varies, So just to go back to our article here, where is her article? Because the next piece of information is kind of interesting. She says the item was huge, or the object was huge, she said, adding that it was definitely not a drone. It was in the same place up in the sky and not moving. We were looking at it and in shock, she wrote. About 5 minutes after seeing the UFO, this is the interesting bit, the woman picked up her mobile phone to begin recording the sighting, but her efforts to capture any footage were thwarted. As soon as she put the phone to the window and tried to record it, she says, the object immediately turned off all lights and took off. It was as if they knew I wanted to record it. So this is a very important piece of information, and it happens again and again and again with UFO sightings. There seems to be some kind of interlock with our consciousness. They seem to sometimes be very aware of our intention, and they seem to be able to tamper with our frontal consciousness and our intention. So one example of this, Richard Dolan, I think, covered this in one of his podcasts. There was this couple in England, and they were, the wife was gardening, and the husband went out to say hello to her. And as he went out, he noticed a UFO. And she, and he said, I went inside to get my video camera. And she went, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. Looked at it for a bit and then went back to gardening. And he filmed it. It was over some steeple in the middle of the village. And he filmed it going behind the steeple and, and then he went back inside. And then he did something really peculiar. He said, I forgot about it. Now, that in itself, I mean, it's something that's covered in those children's movies, Men in Black, can you wipe their memory, But he was really kind of surprised. And it was about a week later, he went to go and video something else when he suddenly went, wait a minute, I've videotaped a UFO. And pulled out the data, and luckily enough, he did have it. And I think Richard Dolan shows it on one of his podcasts. But what's so kind of interesting about their capacity to tamper with our consciousness, I remember one case I saw, and I don't know where the documentary is, but I saw a case of a family in Scotland, and it was a mother, a grandmother, and 2 children, and they were driving in the middle of nowhere in Scotland. She said it was an absolutely beautiful day, clear blue skies. We're driving along the road, and suddenly we see this spaceship, and she said it followed the car. I think they had some radiation. I think afterwards, when they went for medical examination, they had some radiation contamination. I don't even know. I think they might have even had burns. But what I found, the next piece of information I found utterly fascinating. She said in her testimony, they were sitting outside this little cottage and they were talking to the interviewer. And in her testimony, she said, what was really peculiar, what was really strange was that it emitted this incredible wave of love. And she said, we just felt like there was incredible love within us, love for one another, love for the earth. And why that interests me is in my book, The Peculiarities of Dying and the High Strangeness of the Afterlife. That's on Amazon. It's just a small little book that has really interesting people that you could research. But what interests me is that near-death experiencers all talk about meeting a being and being so flooded with love and being so adored that they are overwhelmed. And I don't know where I heard this following point, but I really wonder about it, which is this an inoculation process? You know, so are people who are kind of disarmed by this flood of love, being literally disarmed, you know, being inoculated from the fear of contact. So the other thing that kind of comes across is this idea of telepathy from the object itself. Now, obviously, we think, oh, yeah, no, it's from the inhabitants and it's been directed by the inhabitants. That may well be. But the object itself almost seems to have a capacity to do it. I suppose, technically speaking, we would feel, no, it's the people in the object or the inhabitants of the object that are coordinating and tampering with our consciousness. So a person who is doing a lot of work on that is Dr. Stephen Greer. For those of you who are in the UFO community, you will know who he is. For those of you who aren't, look him up. He's a trained medical doctor. He's been very much to the forefront of the disclosure program. And Dr. Stephen Greer runs these kind of meditation centers where they go out into the desert in America and they sit and meditate and call UFOs towards them. And he has seemingly had a very good success rate, and he very much encourages, if you want to see a UFO, you go ahead and do that by developing up your own consciousness and openness and awareness. Now, I wouldn't be so keen on that, let's just say. I'm kind of from the school of Dr. Jacobs, and I think his name is David. Dr. Jacobs, he is from a school of ufologists that really think there's something very dangerous going on here. He thinks that with all of the abductions that have taken place, that they're done in a very covert manner, that they are done against the person's will, that the person is paralyzed in some way, that then they are interfered with, their genetic material is tampered with, so it's all against your will. So Dr. Jacobs would feel, don't go buzzing an alien. They are dangerous things. So totally up to you and where you feel and this situation. I personally wouldn't encourage it, but that's just me. Now, just to talk about this idea of consciousness, this goes back to Terence Mckenna's experience. And Terence Mckenna, this is an amazing book. It's called The archaic revival. It's a kind of, Terence is very much interested in the psychology of the human being and in consciousness. So he's not taking drugs for a recreational, I'm sure he did at some points, but he's not taking them as purely recreational. He's seeing them very much as an instrument of inquiry. So he would have taken an awful lot of psilocybin and ayahuasca. And I think it was on one of his ayahuasca experiences that as he was coming out of it, he wanted to see a UFO. And lo and behold, he's in the middle of, I think it was South America. He could have been doing it somewhere in North America. I don't know, but I think it was South America. And he said he was in the middle of nowhere. And there appeared a UFO and followed him back to his house. So he very much thought, because of his desire, he did a calling, a beckoning, and that something on his consciousness brought this spacecraft into reality. Now, that was a problem for him. No more than it's a problem for Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée is a scientist who's been in the field of UFOs and ufology for a long time. Joe Rogan does an interview with him if you're interested in looking at him. But this idea that your consciousness is somehow interacting with the craft or with the inhabitants of the craft is something that Jung, the psychotherapist or psychologist, Carl Gustav Jung, discusses. And Carl Jung, when he was looking at this emergence of the UFO in popular culture, he thought that actually what had happened was the collective had gone schizoid, and that as part of their desire for wholeness, they were projecting these mandala shapes into the ether or into the sky as a way to kind of alert themselves that they needed to develop a more holistic approach to their own psychology and their own life. And even though the craft, as I said earlier, all had different shapes, he would still say, yes, they're still shapes of wholeness, you know. So the idea that it's only an internal projection that is happening in the outer world as a way for you to alert yourself into a new crisis where you might at least observe, you know, are you a whole being, or have you gone schizoid, or has the collective gone schizoid? It doesn't sit hugely well with me. I feel to only offer UFO sightings up as some kind of inner desire for completeness, it just is a little bit flimsy, considering they do seem to be technical. The craft seem to have an existence beyond ourselves. They seem to have originated independently, you know. So I'm not fully gone on this whole idea that it is just purely psychological. But the idea that consciousness is involved, very much, I do feel, yes, that is part of the program. So just to, there was a couple of things that I wanted to bring in that I haven't seen mentioned in UFO research that I've done. There's two theories that I would like to throw into the field. And I've been researching for a long time, and I haven't heard these theories. So I hope you find them interesting and new and exciting. And one of them is to do with this idea of consciousness. Actually, they both have to do with this idea of consciousness. I was, no, which one will I talk about first? I was talking to an Indian guru. I'm a yoga teacher and a yoga practitioner, and I've been teaching for 16 years, and I've been researching Indian philosophy and Sanskrit for 16 years. And I had the very good fortune to meet with a very interesting yoga physicist and mathematician when I was in India, and we had a little chat about aliens. And we were in a small group, and he had said to the group, yeah, we can talk freely, you know, she's not going to shut us down and she's not going to be shocked, you know. And I said to him, look, what do you think the alien agenda is, you know? And so you know the theories that are out there in the alien community, why UFOs are coming to visit, is everything from the biodiversity of the planet Earth, the ecological biodiversity of the planet Earth. Others are saying, no, there's a slave trade. Everyone that goes missing is being abducted and taken off planet. Others say they're here to mine Earth for every every mineral they can get a hold of. Others are saying, no, we're food. So there's this various theories. But I thought this one was really interesting, particularly pertaining to the whole idea of consciousness. And what he said to me was, actually, one of the reasons they're very interested in us is that most galactic communities operate in a collective. So not dissimilar to the Borg or the hive mind that Star Trek proposed. But he said, they operate telepathically. So they have no privacy. And he said one of the reasons they are incredibly interested in Earth is that we are one of these very rare planets where the inhabitants can individuate. And that just pinged with me. I just thought, oh, that's a really interesting proposition. If you were in a tribe where all you could do was collectively organize yourselves and there is no real privacy and there is no real growth beyond the tribe, that would be a really interesting individuation, and a group of people that could possibly individuate would be a really interesting phenomena. And I mean, of course, not all of us individuate on Earth. Most of us are culturally inculcated, we are entrained, we enjoy the group think, it's part of our protective process. You can even see there's a very interesting author called Christina Lerner. She's now dead as well. She was a Scottish lecturer on the witch craze, and she wrote a very interesting book called Religion and the Politics of Religion and the Politics of Witchcraft, I think is what she called the book. But she's a very interesting opening chapter. And in her opening chapter, she talks about the collective continually goes through processes of purging. And particularly with regard to the individual. So when the individual comes into the collective doesn't like it. It immediately senses there's a change happening within the broad spectrum of collective thinking, and it will attack. So, of course, great symbols of this individual being attacked is, of course, Jesus Christ being crucified on the cross. An individual coming into the collective to upgrade the collective consciousness. No, we're going to expel you. You're going to be purged. And actually, Christina Lerner talks about the Nazi purging of the Jews as a sample. That this kind of almost viral thought and viral reaction to an individual and to change coming is pretty universal, and it's usually extremely violent. And that brings me back to the work of Dr. John E. Mack, because when you're looking at the idea of why are these spacecraft coming, what are they looking at, and why are they abducting people who seem to be, who are very ordinary, who are in many ways quite unremarkable. They're just decent people walking the earth, going about their life, doing no harm to anybody, and yet aliens seem to be plucking them out of their daily life and giving them a whole set of experience and then dropping them back in. Because, I mean, as you know, Eisenhower would speak about the industrial might, and we all have it in our heads that, oh, when the aliens come, take me to your leader, or oh, when the aliens come, it'll be dealt with by the military who will have a whole load of secret information and know what they're doing. In fact, Eisenhower talks about it with regard to the industrial, what did he call it now? I have it here in my notes. The industrial, bear with me. Yeah. So he gave it in his farewell speech in January of 17th of 1961, the industrial complexes. So he says, and it's a really interesting kind of warning shot out to the collective. Our toil, resources and livelihood are all involved, and so is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. So this is something that the UFO community constantly talk about, which is this idea of the deep state of industrial complexes having acquired alien tech. I mean, Werner von Braun, who was brought over as part of Operation Paperclip, I think that's the name of the operation. He was a Nazi scientist who said, you know, we got help, we got outside help, you know, from up there. So he's the one who more or less kind of let slip, you know, there may be aliens involved. We have alien tech, or we have very advanced tech. And at some point I probably will go into doing something on the Vril Society. And again, you'll see how they were very influential with regard to contacting other galaxies and the idea of aliens. So as most of you know, the Nazis were very interested in magic and the esoteric. But just to go back to the whole idea of alien infiltration, when we look at any of these UFO sightings, firstly, it's very interesting how the media cover them. And Richard Dolan, Linda Moulton Howe, George Knapp, all of these people discuss how mainstream media won't touch UFOs, except for Carlson on Fox News. He's fascinated by them. And most of us don't want to look at Fox News because of the whole Trump era of Fox News. But anyway, so our feeling is more or less that alien activity is being monitored by industrial complexes. Alien tech has been retrieved by military sources. Bob Lazar's really interesting interview with Joe Rogan and Corbell's film and George Knapp's research on Bob Lazar is fascinating. And I think particularly because Bob Lazar said, I think I said George Lazar there, but Bob Lazar said he had been shown alien tech and he was to, what's that thing, retro engineer it. He was to back engineer the machinery. And he talked about an element 115 in the 1980s that only recently has been added to the periodic table. And, you know, he's suffered hugely at the hands of the collective because, again, he's an individual bringing in testimony. But in the main, we always think that it is the military that's handling the alien question. And then it looks like the aliens themselves have a separate agenda. Whoever they are, some of them seem to definitely have a separate agenda. We have two schools, two branches. One is that the military are in talk with aliens, that aliens have been long negotiating with both KGB and American powers. The recent release of Skinny Bob, if you've seen the Skinny Bob tapes on YouTube, that has a KGB logo on it. So this idea that, you know, that the larger powerhouses and power sources in whatever country have some kind of information that's to do with the alien craft. Now, listen, of course, there's plenty who'll say, and many skeptics who'll say, the alien craft are dark tech, you know, nothing to do with other neighbouring inhabitants. But just to get back to the idea that the aliens may have a separate agenda outside of contacting large military sources, it's very much covered with Dr. John E. Mack, because as he analysed his patients, he was looking for a pathology. He was looking for neurosis. He was looking for a new disease, a new spiritual disease, or a new literal psychotic disease. And what his conclusion was no, these people are having a genuine experience. These people are coming back as witness bearers. He really appreciated them. He said they're coming back as witness bearers into the collective to tell us something is going on, to alert us. And being the collective, we're rejecting it all the time. So I don't know if you know the philosopher Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer has this definition of truth, that a truth, when it's first brought to the collective, is denied, then it is ridiculed, and then it is taken as self-evident, you know. So my kind of new theory, and this is my second new theory. So the first theory is perhaps aliens are very interested, and it's not mine, as you know, I got it from an Indian guru, that aliens may be very interested in us because we individuate. The next theory that I'd like to propose is to do with the work of Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. So for any of you who are interested in the paranormal, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake is a very conventional professor of microbiology with Cambridge University. He trained I think in Cambridge or Oxford, one of those leading lights in with regard to universities. And he did study for a while, or he did research work for a while in Hyderabad. So I definitely think he came in contact with, and he would have anyway, come in contact with the yogic principles of divisions of how information travels. So yogis, if any of you are interested in yoga, will know that the Indian culture, and particularly the spiritual Indian culture, is incredibly meticulous at annotating and subdividing and collating data on all aspects of consciousness. And that includes, that's one of my cats trying to get in, that includes, how information moves throughout our system as a human being, and how it moves throughout our mental field as a human being, and then how it moves out and is and interacts and works with others. So perhaps Dr. Sheldrake, in his awareness around yogic principles, I think he is a yoga practitioner, but even if he isn't, he would have worked in Hyderabad and he would have come in contact with yoga principles of information, spiritual information, and the transmission thereof. He had, it was like a union, it was like a beautiful union, if you like. He has this pretty conventional training in molecular biology and in cell structures and how cells work. And then he comes in contact with yogic principles of how information travels. And the two made a beautiful union. And he has now developed this very in-depth theory around what he calls morphogenetic fields. So again, I'll put the site on, but I think it's of relevance to the whole idea of ufology and the idea of abducting an individual and then putting them back into their life, and what that might be doing to the morphic field. So this is just a brief description. I'll put this up on site. Sheldrake proposes that there is a field within and around a morphic unit which organizes its characteristic structure, pattern, and activity. So basically he's saying, and I think it's a Hobbesian idea, or it's certainly one of the earlier philosophers, English philosophers, I think, idea, that matter forms through habit, just as much as psychological disposition, cultural growth, all form through habit. And the only way of, I'm going to have to let that cat in, the only way of altering the habit is either, is to kind of externally introduce a new idea, or internally. But whatever happens, once that change occurs, it proliferates out into the morphic field. So now, let me just see. In layman terms, the theory proposes that any form looks always alike because it remembers its form through repetition, and that any new forms having similar characteristics will use the pattern of similar forms already existing as a guide for its appearance. So with his morphic resonance, this is a feedback mechanism between the field and the corresponding forms of morphic units. And this is where I'm wondering, is the alien abduction program aware of morphic resonance, and that it knows that, or the community knows that the way of altering our consciousness is to tamper with the morphic field? And how do you tamper with the morphic field? You individually extract individuals, give them a set of experiences, and drop the data back into the field, and that resonance opens out the question, and the question opens out newness and new thought ideas, generate a vibrationary fear, but then also a certain excitement around exploration, and then open up to the whole idea, oh, if this is so, then how do we contact? Then what do we do? So are they tampering with the morphic? Are the alien community and are these UFO sightings all about tampering with morphic resonance? So they're two new propositions that I haven't really heard in terms of alien visitation and the I just have a little note here as well, just with regard to morphic resonance, this idea of habit and this idea of information occupying certain frequencies and fields. I remember once hearing an autistic man who had an incredible talent for reciting prime numbers. And as you know, the deeper you go into the number field, the more complex it is to know the next prime number. But he described it in a very interesting way. He said that what I do is I hover over the field of numbers, and as I pass my consciousness over them, the next prime number comes up and lights up. So it's like this inner flare, is our consciousness having an inner flare that, alien or spacecraft or other civilizations can pick up on, and that we ourselves are very unaware of. So I just thought it was a very interesting way to describe his experience with regard to prime numbers. Now, where did I want to go after this? The whole idea of individuation I thought was very interesting, because any of you who are interested in Jung and individuation, or who are interested in psychology, know that the process of individuation is extremely difficult. Standing out from the collective is extremely difficult, and it requires courage. So for those of you who are interested in the work of Dr. Jordan Peterson, for example, and his wife Tammy, you can see that there's great personal courage required, and a lot of people just don't have the heart for it. And that's why yoga is really encourages you to develop an inner strength, to have enough courage to look at the awfulness of yourself. It's not a pretty picture, and that's why a lot of people do yoga, because it gives them the wherewithal and the strength to sit, observe, and not reject, and just watch, and then see if they can participate in reshaping their own, or in individuating. So even the whole idea of individuation is a yogic idea, so Jung and that circle in the 1920s, they were plundering yogic manuscripts. They were stealing an awful lot of yogic psychological principles to refresh the material and bring it to the West. So just one other thing that I wanted to mention, I noticed that I haven't, and it's just with relation to Ireland and UFOs. I might have to let that cat in, because that cat is just going to keep meowing. So hang on. Come in. No. Okay, so just to go back to UFOs and aliens, with in particular in relationship to Ireland, and it's something I will be looking at again and again. I will, as part of my paranormal menu, I will be going back onto the whole alien idea and UFO idea. But for now, there was a very interesting group of interviews that were put up that Dr. John Mack did with school children in Zimbabwe. And when I went to look for them today to put up the link for you to see, they're gone. So they were original, I think they were taken in the late 1990s video. But anyway, I'll tell you what I saw, and in particular in relationship to Ireland. So in Zimbabwe, there was this very, very famous, sighting by a group of really young kids from 7, 8, 9. And they were in this very kind of posh school with their little uniform, and they had terribly posh little accents. And the school children ran into the teachers and said, "Oh my God, we've seen an alien." And the teachers were like, the children were so distressed. The teachers really believed them, and they didn't think, "Oh, this is group hysteria." They didn't think it was kind of some kind of global hysterical phenomenon. So what they did was it just so happened, I think, that Dr. Mack and his assistant were traveling to Africa. I don't know why, or else they went purposely to interview the kids. And they're very kind of chilling kind of interviews. They're really weird aliens. I hadn't heard of aliens that looked like this. They said they had obviously the usual big black eyes, but some of them said they had long stringy black hair. They were tiny. They were around 4 foot. And actually, I'm going to put a clip up that Joe Rogan is interviewing somebody about this particular set of interviews from these African children. And Joe Rogan keeps going, "Why would the aliens talk to children? Like, is it that the kids were the same height as the aliens that they thought of?" And I'd say, "No, Joe, it's to do with the morphic resonance. They're about their business, trying to get the world to know, listen, things are happening." But the message, and it's the usual message that comes from aliens, is that our technology is a problem, and that our ecology is incredibly special and diverse, and we're absolutely destroying it, and we have to stop. But this happened in the 1990s, and the children are really, they've all drawn very similar things, although some saw other kinds of aliens, so it's kind of interesting. One little girl said it hopped across the grass, and I was thinking about that afterwards and thinking, oh, but what if it didn't hop across the grass, but it just looked like it was hopping across the grass, and it's actually the only way she could visually describe it cloaking in and out of her perception, because they tend to do this thing where they can cloak. So I just wondered if that was her way of kind of describing, actually, it wasn't that it was hopping, it was that it was walking towards her, but there were times when it flashed out of being seen. Others said, oh, they were very evil. And then the thing that really stuck with me with relation to to Ireland in particular, in Ireland, we have a tradition that certain musicians are given certain tunes from the fairies. And I mentioned Jacques de Vallée earlier. Jacques de Vallée is a scientist. He's a French scientist. Steven Spielberg uses him as an inspiration for one of his main characters in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And Jacques de Vallée has written extensively on the correlation and the similarities between fairy lore and alien abduction. And that'll be something I'll be looking at as well in another podcast. But Jacques de Vallée has said that there's similarities between how aliens are described, that they can enchant you. In other words, you're paralyzed and you can't move. That they can make you float, that you just float away. That time distortions occur. He noticed all of that. But one of the things that we in Ireland regularly say is like, oh, where'd you get that tune? Oh, fairies gave that tune now to so-and-so and such, and he handed the tune down to me. And why I'm mentioning that piece of lore is that one of the girls, tiny little round-faced girl with a kind of a fringe, is speaking to Dr. Mack, and she said to Dr. Mack, I could hear the ship coming. And Dr. Mack pressed her a bit more, and he said, what do you mean? What kind of noise did it make? And she sat and she thought, and she said, it made the sound of a flute. And that just immediately just went me, okay, that's unusual. It's an unusual way of describing something, that it sounded like an instrument making a tune. So I thought it was another little segue into those Zimbabwe interviews. Now, I know for a long time they were up online. The original were up online. I think since then there has been a film made about those witnesses now that they're grown up. and what happened in their lives. I haven't seen it, so I'd be very interested to see it. But it is such a pity that I can't find the original on YouTube in the way that it was. They were up there before. And I suppose the other thing that I find very interesting about that is that the kids weren't hypnotized. They were just speaking and giving their testimony. And I think that's probably one of the problems with Dr. Mack's work. I mean, I love it. I would absolutely recommend you read this book. But I suppose what we skeptics, I think I can be skeptical at times, even though I'm very open-minded, is we worry about information retrieved or harvested through the process of hypnosis. And that's just purely because, you know, when you're in that state, you're in a highly suggestible state. Directed questioning can start to distort the information coming out. So while I'd be interested in being hypnotized, I worry, and I think everybody worries about the veracity which isn't fair either, because really what hypnosis shows and is a demonstration of in and of itself is that our consciousness can be tweaked. Our consciousness and it can be brought into a liminal state where it opens up to further information, you know. And I suppose with remote viewing as well, you're finding that consciousness can behave in a very different way, and that perhaps hypnosis is also trustworthy in the way that remote viewing is trustworthy, you know, for getting information. So that is the first podcast. I wanted to see, did she have anything else to say at the end of the article with regard to her sighting of the UFO, or the couple's sighting of the UFO. She added that she tended to be a skeptical person and she'd never previously believed in UFOs. And I mean, I find that just so weird, how people can just go, no, I don't believe in them, as though it's a kind of a fairy tale. I mean, and particularly now because of the Blumenthal article in the New York Times. I think once those articles were released and the footage from the Pentagon were released in 2017, the UFO field is ablaze once again. You know, the idea that governments are releasing information saying, yes, they exist. I mean, you had the very famous case of the Canadian Defence Minister, now dead, Paul Hellyer, who was very much to the forefront of disclosure and who spoke about aliens very openly. And I suppose the Israeli Defence Minister coming out now and saying, yep, they're aliens, we're in contact with them, you know. So the idea of skepticism has certainly diminished, particularly with the work of, or the testimony of David Fravor. There's another just piece of information that's just popped into my head with regard to Ireland. There's a very interesting case that Richard Dolan and also the Ancient Aliens team, so many people have covered this case. I think Richard Dolan wrote a book on it. It's the Rendlesham Forest case. Now, I think that might have been, it's a military base, and it might have been, and it's in England, and it might be also a nuclear silo. I'm not sure. But it's definitely a military base. And there were some American soldiers posted there. I mean, this is my understanding of it. And one of them was a young sergeant. Now, that case went on where a UFO turned up for 3 nights in a row. Loads of men went out and witnessed it. The general of the camp made several tape recordings. And again, I'd recommend Richard Dolan. He does excellent research work and he would have all the data for you. But with regard to Rendlesham Forest, one of the American guys who went out and saw, it was a triangular craft, and I think it was around Christmas, and he was on duty, and he went out with a fellow soldier, and they came across this small triangular craft, and he said it had a hieroglyphics on the side. He said, I touched the craft, and it returned for 2 or 3 nights. But what was very interesting, and I think it was Ancient Aliens who did this interview many, many, many years later, when the sergeant had retired from the army and was now an older man. And he said, it happened that I had a dream. And in the dream, I was seeing all these zeros and slashes. And he said, and I woke up, I had a notebook by the bed, and I just kept putting down zeros and slashes, zeros and slashes, zeros and slashes. And he said, and I woke up the next day, and I looked and I had pages and pages of zeros and ones. And he went, binary code. So he brought the notebook to somebody who put it into an algorithm who could decipher, binary code. And guess what it said? Now, I'm paraphrasing here, but there's one particular name place that I'm not paraphrasing. And I think what it said was, experiment Earth ongoing. And then it said something like, it gave coordinates. And when they looked up the coordinates, it related to a space off the Irish Sea where a mythological island appears and disappears every 7 years called High Brazil. So I just thought, oh, that's very interesting, and islands and subaquatic UFOs, or these intermediate UFOs, will also be another topic that we can look at. So just with regard to skepticism, there's so much news footage. Again, the skeptics tend to say it's our tech. So I remember seeing really, and it's very dramatic news footage, and I'm sure it's up on YouTube unless they've taken it down, which was over the Dome of the Mount in Jerusalem. This white orb descended, I think it was 2014, I think thereabouts, over the dome. And then it did this thing, it was white and blazing, and then it did this thing which is, it sent out a strobe light that lit up the whole city, and then the ship shot vertically up into space. Now, that was on every news outlet, from the BBC to CNN to every news outlet, because there were numerous recordings of it. Like, there were people just took out their mobile phones, it was recorded, and then off they went. And again, it's one of those things, and this is what you find the longer you research anomalous material. We don't have a place to catalogue it, so we tend to forget. And we also have very busy lives. We have to feed ourselves, we have to pay the rent, we have to pay bills, we have to just make sure that we're healthy and okay. So we don't really have time to be worrying about this apparition of a UFO over Jerusalem, So I still am amazed that you can show any amount of footage. You can have any amount of footage analysed and show to people, and they'll still go, don't believe it. That it becomes a matter of faith rather than, oh, that's interesting, I wonder what's going on there. Anyway, so she said she tended to be skeptical. I wonder if she's skeptical now, still, having been a witness bearer. And I must say, I'm really pleased that they did put their testimony in. That's the other thing Richard Dolan was talking about in one of his recent podcasts. He was discussing this with some other ufologist, and that guy was a statistician collecting metadata on observations. And he said, look, for every one craft that it is logged as sighted, he said you can have up to 10,000 witnesses. And he said the Phoenix lights bear that out. That UFO hung in the sky for 5 hours. There were endless witnesses. The whole city saw it. But not as many as saw it reported the sighting, So the idea that, and I'm very pleased that her and her partner did. And I would love, oh my God, I would so love to have a discussion with them. So if they happen to see this, would you please contact me? And I'd just love to get your testimony and get it down, and just any other details. I mean, I would say the only thing, because I've seen a UFO myself, I have friends that have seen UFOs. In the end, there's very little you could actually say. When I was young, I was a teenager, so I saw a UFO in Tala. I was reared in Tala. For those of you not in Ireland, Tala is very big. It's about 100,000, 150,000 urban populations. It's a suburb of Dublin. And I looked out the window at about 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, 3 o'clock in the morning, as we all know, is a very interesting time. 3, half 3 is a very interesting time on Earth. In fact, I might release this podcast at 3:30 in the morning, just for the fun of it. But anyway, I looked out the window when I was a teenager, and I looked over the rooftops and suddenly saw this white light with a blue light on top come streaking across the sky. And I'm looking at it going, is it? You know, what is it? Is it a plane? And then it did a very typical maneuver. It immediately took a sharp 90-degree angle, like just incredibly sharp, and just shot out of sight. So it behaved in a very odd way. And that would have been in the 1970s. So like, it was not our tech that I knew of then. And a lot of people talk about this high speed, particularly David Faver. And I think him and Alex Friedman discuss, they get terribly technical. For any of you who don't know about Alex Friedman, he is an amazing podcaster. He is a developer of artificial intelligence, young man, Russian extract, very intelligent and knowledgeable and loving and open. And him and David are obviously amazing mathematicians, way above my head, but they were working out the nautical miles of the spacecraft that David Fravor, the naval pilot, saw, and that huge article that was written in the New York Times. Their interview is with him. He was the pilot of the craft, the fighter craft that had been sent out to follow the UFO or UAP. So I'll just read on further. The last previous report from Mullingar to the site was made, and this is the central, let's just see, the National UFO Reporting Centre website. They say here, the journalist here says the informant, the last one was in 2016 when a poster described 24-second viewing of two triangular craft and a connecting energy beam. Now that's interesting because when Ingo Swann talks about his viewing of a UFO, it's triangular and it comes over a lake. But Ingo's description of its materialization is actually really interesting now that I think about it. I should have had that prepared. Because he talks about it almost came... It was as though it burst through a membrane, it was his description, which brings us back to the Israeli defense minister describing what is space. So Ingo Swann talks about this mist suddenly kind of forming in the air, and through the mist, this triangular spacecraft appeared over this lake. And this idea of membranes, or this kind of idea of tearing something open to come into, wouldn't be our traditional physical or a traditional idea of space, and at the moment it wouldn't correlate with our idea of the physics of space. But then, just to go back to, it was a triangular craft that started to shoot beams down on the earth, and there was a tree nearby exploding, and he was like, what the hell's going on? And it also shot into the water, which brings me back to the very first item that I read for you this evening. If you read further onto Jason's site, you'll see that the descriptions from Ireland were that something was shot from a spear of light. A spear was shot down onto the ground. Now, how else would you describe a beam being shot down if you didn't have that technology at the time? So Ingo said it seemed to have been doing something with the water, that it was like either harvesting the water or harvesting the fish life, and that it just seemed to be just for its own pleasure, just killing wildlife. That was his take on it. He said, like, it was just bizarre. It just seemed to be kind of like, there's a deer, kill it, oh, this tree here, shoot at it, So it just seemed to be, he described that it just seemed to be randomly shooting at things while it was doing something in the lake. And it seemed to have hung over the lake for about 4 hours. So that's interesting. And then it's interesting with regard to the Irish testimony of those craft that were sighted over Clonmacnoise. So prior to that, there was a report filed on November 25th, 2011. It stated that around 5:30 to 6 a.m, while out walking his dog, the informant noticed a red flashing light going across the sky. This then became a yellow flashing light. The informant thought at first that the object was a plane, but then realised it was flying in an odd pattern. It moved up and down and also went faster and slower, like it was hovering in the air. When he got home, he looked again, and it was just over his village. He noticed a white light hovering over, or I should watch this, my mic is there. He noticed a white light hovering over the village and going back and forth and up and down. So not dissimilar to the way, if you look at the Pentagon files that were released of the spaceship that was on a gimbal, you know, that kind of going up and down and doing these odd maneuvers that you're kind of going, well, our craft can't do that, but, you know, I don't know what's going on there. When he got home, the next morning the informant witnessed a similar spectacle, but when he attempted to take a photo, the lights disappeared. Up to now, I was very skeptical about all this, but as of now, my mind is in two places as to what is going on around here in the night sky, the informant wrote. Yes, I don't really think there's room for skepticism anymore. You know, the whole idea of life in the universe and the whole idea of having alien neighbours is ancient. You know, philosophers discussed it. The founders of the American democracy believed in a thing called the plurality of worlds and had long conversations about it. And that's in the 18th century. But it goes right back, you know, through millennia, where people discuss this idea of other forms of life. Like William Blake, the mystic and poet William Blake, you know, he was very perceptive. I'll be talking about him in near-death experiences because he saw his brother's body rise out, or his spirit rise out of his body when he died. But William Blake, and he went out one morning and saw a 10-foot angel in the tree, in a tree in his garden, you know. So his description is our perception. It's again all to do with, look, the world and our experience of life is much more complex than we could ever know. The mystic Swedenborg discusses alien life forms in the afterlife. You know, in the skull experiment, which I'm hopefully going to be doing, I'd love to do an interview with Robin Foy from the Skulls group. If you haven't seen the film Afterlife Investigations on YouTube, oh my God, go check it out. It's very, very interesting. And actually, the scientist, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, appears in that video. But in the Skulls experiment, they have video recordings of alien faces as well, which is, you know, and again, is supposedly in the afterlife. So that's a very interesting proposition. You know, I mean, it's really back down to the whole idea, look, everything is very complex. Life is very complex. And since the world wars, we've become very spiritually depressed naturally, you know, and since secularism and the rise of secularism, you can see that there's a desire for spiritual inquiry and really solid spiritual inquiry. I'm not interested in evangelical kind of responses to things, and I'm not interested in shoddy research work. You know, I like very good propositions put forward, and I hate this Sagan quote, you know, extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. Sometimes it's Occam's razor, you know, sometimes it's just the obvious and is straightforward, and it doesn't need to be extraordinary. So I would always say that anomalous events are going on around us all the time. And in fact, we're experiencing them quite a bit. It's just that we tend to forget we've experienced them because we haven't quite figured out how to hold anomalous information. And this is down to Aristotelian causality. I mean, when you look at the fact that there was a global shift in consciousness around 500 BCE when writing really came to the fore and people were no longer using mnemonics to remember information. Once we started writing, there was a shift in our consciousness. Once the Vedas started to be recorded, once Indian philosophers started to use pen and paper, the same with the Grecians, they had to engage in left brain functioning, which is organize their thoughts in a very linear pattern, use editing processes to clarify information. And, you know, it's a fantastic tool. I'm in no way saying abandon Aristotelian causality, but I am saying exactly what the physicist Pauli and what Niels Bohr and what Einstein have all said, there are other ways of harvesting information as well. And that's right brain functioning. And that will be something we will look at going forward. I think for next time, I'm hoping to broadcast either every week or every 2 weeks. For next time, I might look at remote viewing. I'm a member of, I've started to run a remote viewing group here in the Midlands, and I have got fellow paranormal enthusiasts who are working with me. And in fact, they're setting up a site called Strange Happenings. So I would absolutely recommend you support them. We are just interested in all things paranormal. And I'll be running the Paranormal Ireland news desk. And I really hope it's going to be very interactive. Please contact me. I would be absolutely chuffed to hear whatever stories you might have, whatever experiences you might have had that are paranormal. You know, whether it's clairvoyance, whether it's dreams, precognition and dreams come true, whether it's high synchronicities and high coincidences, whether it's just high strangeness, poltergeist activity, UFO sightings, alien abduction, spirit sightings, seeing the dead, being visited by the dead, being given messages by the dead, you know, whatever that is on the psi scale of strangeness, please contact me. Write in the comments or DM me. Yeah, that's it. Please do stay in touch. As I say, the next episode will hopefully be on remote viewing. I'll go through, I'm going to have to try and find, maybe I'm the Irish example of remote viewing. I'm going to have to find an Irish example of remote viewing. I have somebody in mind, but I think it might qualify more as automatic writing than remote viewing. But then the correlation between our automatic writing and remote viewing is quite high. So that will be for the next episode. I hope you got something out of this first report from the Paranormal Ireland news desk. And I will put my sources up and my recommendations up, and anybody that I might have mentioned, I will put that up on site as well. So thank you very much for staying with me, and stay safe.